Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome here this evening to this on Cumann, the Historical Studies Society of the University of Galway's first lecture in their short series of lectures focusing on the overall theme of impactful or indeed significant elections in the Irish state, or I suppose I should be more specific, impactful or significant general elections in the Irish state. For the purposes of this lecture series, we won't be focusing particularly on, or won't be focusing at all on lectures relating to Northern Ireland. And the subject of tonight's lecture, of course, is, as you know, it comes under the title of Stability or Chaos, the 1927 general elections. And that's elections in the plural, because there was, of course, 2 elections in that particular calendar year. One of only 2 instances in the history of the Irish state in which there were 2 elections in the same calendar year. There were various occasions, as many of you would probably know, in which there were other elections that were quite close to each other in their proximity from a chronological perspective, such as the 1932 and 1933 elections, similarly with the 1937 and 1938 elections, and then, of course, also the 1943 and 1944 elections. But the 2 elections in 1927 was one, as I say, of only 2 instances in which they were in the same calendar year. The other being, of course, during that particularly economically turbulent period of the early 1980s, in which we had 2 elections in 1982 in February and November of that year, respectively. So, before we proceed, I think it would be understandable just to address a question with respect to why we chose to begin this series with these elections of 1927 and not with what many of you would probably recognise as the incredibly important and perhaps in some ways much more impactful elections of 1922, what's generally referred to as the Pact election, though I usually refer to it as the Treaty election, and indeed also the general election of 1923. They both obviously preceded the elections we're discussing this evening, so you might wonder why we didn't discuss them first, or why we didn't devote a lecture to them. Well, in relation to the 1922 election, the Pact election or the Treaty election, there was really 2 reasons why we chose not to begin the series with this particular election. And that's because, well, I suppose to paraphrase a reference to this period from that bogeyman of Irish nationalism, sometimes Winston Churchill, the 1922 election here occurred during what you could call the interregnum, the period between the gradual moving away of British authority in Ireland and the embryonic movement towards an independent Irish state. So when the June 1922 election took place, the Irish Free State was not yet in existence. It was still the provisional period. And so therefore, for that reason, or that's one of the reasons why we opted to focus on post-1922 elections, after the Irish Free State came into existence on the 6th of December 1922. Because again, technically, this particular election was, from a strictly legal perspective, if not necessarily from our nationalist perspective, but from a legal perspective, it was arguably still a regional election within the United Kingdom, because we had not yet left that particular entity. And the second reason then is much more prosaic as to why we chose not to opt for discussing the 22 election, and that is because we're only recently after completing, in effect, the decade of centenaries, and there's been a plethora of discussion and academic commentary and indeed much writing on the subject of the 1922 election, so we felt we would be just raking over ground that has been very recently furrowed by others. And that largely second reason is also why we chose not to begin our series with the 1923 general election either, of which you can see some key characters there on the left. On your left, W.T. Cosgrave, the leader of the Cumann Gael government at that time and the Cumann Gael party. And to his right there, Éamon de Valera, the leader of what was generally referred to as the Republican contingent at this time. And then, of course, on your far right there, but he would not be particularly a far right man, the leader of the Labour Party at the time, Thomas Johnson. So we opted not to focus on this election either because, again, first of all, it was the subject of a lecture only just last September by the sister organisation of this society, the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, in which we had Dr. Mel Farrell, who gave us a very detailed synopsis and analysis of the 1923 election. And on that note, only recently, Dr. Farrell, together with others, have produced an excellent collection of essays on the subject of the 1923 election, entitled Vying for Victory, and I can highly recommend it. It's a compendium of essays by various authors and historians, and certainly if any of you have an interest in learning more about that election, I can highly recommend that particular publication. So there are the reasons why we chose to jump forward, as it were, in this series to the two elections of 1927. But before we proceed to discussing the specifics of the campaigns and the context of the 1927 elections, it is important that you understand the context that led up to them. And in particular, one could argue the outcome of the 1923 election did have some impact on how the campaign will be fought and on the context of the campaign in the first election of June 1927. So in relation to the 1923 election then, as you can see there, at the end of the 1923 election, or following the 1923 election, the largest political party at that time was ultimately Cumann, which had previously been the old pro-treaty Sinn Féin element that had accepted the treaty back in 1921, 1922. That was led, as I mentioned earlier there, by Cosgrave. So they had returned at that election with 63 seats. The largest party then overall of all those that were competing in that election. But note there that that did not give them a majority in the Dáil, because a working majority in the new Dáil, the third Dáil as it would have been after the fourth Dáil after the election of 1923, would have been a majority of 77. So they were still a minority in terms of, they did not have a majority in order to form a government. I'm going to skip forward for a second to the Farmers' Party. They came back with a total of 15 seats. Now, as the name suggests, they largely focused on matters relating to agricultural issues, farming issues, particularly established farmers, it's fair to say. Not necessarily only big farmers, but established farmers. So it didn't always necessarily represent what you could call the farm labourers, or those who might be more focused on, who could be of a more left-wing persuasion, but in an agricultural context. The next party there is the Labour Party. They returned with 14 seats, I apologise. They returned with 14 seats under the leadership of Thomas Johnson. And again, I don't need to explain too much, I'd imagine, about the Labour Party. It's kind of obvious from the name, a party that came from a left-wing disposition, and with slightly more, depending on your perspective, progressive social policies, and certainly a more left-wing economic persuasion vis-a-vis the Farmers' Party, or indeed Cumann. Although at this time the Labour Party was in many ways a rural party, again much of its support from rural, small town base, etc. Another party there that's of interest but won't be mentioning too much is the Businessman's Party. They returned with 2 seats to this parliament. They largely represented what you could call elements of the ex-unionist persuasion, or the old unionist persuasion as it might have been in the Dublin area. And then underneath them there, the Cork Progressive Association, a somewhat similar scenario, just to be brief about it, to the Businessman's Party, but in the Cork area. And then lastly, we had 13 independents return to this parliament, the 1923 or 4th Dáil Parliament, which represented a variety of perspectives and hues. Some of them ex-unionist, others ex-Irish Parliamentary Party, the old Home Rule Party, others simply representing sectional interests in their areas. So this is where the lay of the land was in relation to what you could call the pro-treaty elements, or the elements that were prepared to actually sit in Parliament, which is quite distinct from the last element that I skipped over there, the Republicans, as they were generally known at the time. They returned with 44 seats. Now, this was the group essentially led by Éamon de Valera at this time, the anti-treaty section of the old Sinn Féin, which had rejected the treaty. They returned, as I say, with 44 seats at that election in 1923. And there might be a rather obvious question again that springs to mind. Why are they not called Sinn Féin? Well, the scenario here is that essentially there was another interregnum, if you will. At this point in time, at the August election of 1923, the Cumann Party under Cosgrave had only recently dropped the name Sinn Féin themselves. They'd only formed the Cumann Party in April of 1923 and had decided to create a new organisation and to call it Cumann. This then left the Sinn Féin name free for someone else to use, essentially, and it meant now that Éamon de Valera's Cumann Public Party, or Cumann Public section, which you can see written up there as well. This was a party that de Valera had formed in March 1922 at the time of the treaty split in order to fight against the treaty, because he felt that the majority of Sinn Féin, or at least the elected delegates of Sinn Féin, were probably going to take the organisation. So he formed a new organisation called Cumann Public. But by virtue of the Civil War, the issues relating to the Pact election, and then ultimately the decision of Cumann to dispense with the name themselves, it left the Sinn Féin name free for others to use. But this period between the end of the Civil War in April 1923 and this election in August 1923, it was a period of flux. And it took some time in order for Éamon de Valera's anti-treatyite grouping, which was still somewhat disorganised, some of them were even on the run from the army still at this point, towards the end of the Civil War, to get themselves reorganised into a new fighting political unit, if you will. And so therefore the name Cumann na Gael continued, or Cumann na Publica continued to be used occasionally. More often than not, they simply refer to themselves as Republicans. And the first time that this party coalesced again as a new party, a new anti-treaty Sinn Féin party, was at their Ardèche in October 1923. Okay, and indeed, just as one quick example here, right up until the day of the election on the 27th of August, the Cumann na Publica grouping was still issuing receipts for donations, this one is from America, to people who were donating to the Republicans' election fund. So this gives an indication as to why, in this particular context, the term anti-treaty Sinn Féin is not really used. It's usually more Republicans when referring to this grouping. But more importantly, they refused to enter the Dáil anyway. Because de Valera's grouping were anti-treaty, refused to accept not just the oath of allegiance to the British King or the oath of allegiance to the Irish Constitution and oath of fidelity to the British King, which they found repugnant. That was a stipulation of the treaty, as many of you know. But also they refused to recognise even the legitimacy of the Dáil itself anyway to govern Ireland at that point, seeing it as a partitionist puppet parliament imposed on Ireland by the British. This was broadly the type of propaganda that was being used. With the result then that in the Parliament, because the 44 Republican, as they were known, TDs, again, broadly speaking, Éamon de Valera's TDs, refused to enter Parliament, this meant now that the working majority, the actual working majority in Parliament was reduced to 55, which meant that the Cumann na Gael section, with 63 seats, had a clear majority now in terms of the other parties in government. And this now meant that for the next number of years, Cumann na Gael, under W.T. Cosgrave, with its roughly 60 to 63 seats, depending on how the ebbs and tides of by-elections would work in the intervening years, would have a relatively safe and secure majority until the next election in June 1927. Now, whilst they had a secure majority in Parliament, this did not mean they had no opposition whatsoever. And there was a very conscientious, even if it was limited in terms of its scope and potency, a very conscientious level of opposition provided in Parliament to Cumann na Gael by parties such as Thomas Johnson's Labour Party, but also to a certain extent, and I apologise for the grainy pictures, the best I could get, the Farmers' Party, and that's the leader of the Farmers' Party for the first number of years of the state, a man called Dennis Gorey. So, but the Farmers' Party, again, it had a lot of different interests in it. They were all of an agricultural persuasion, but some were smaller farmers, others middling farmers, and others perhaps slightly towards what could be known as the big farmer persuasion. Not too many, but some. With the result that they actually found themselves quite ad idem, or quite supportive of much of Cumann na Gael's policies, at least in the agricultural field, during the mid-1920s. The Cumann na Gael Minister for Agriculture, Patrick Hogan, was a dedicated man when it came to improving the lot of the agricultural sector here in Ireland, and so a lot of Cumann na Gael policies chimed quite positively with members of the Farmers' Party. And as we shall see, this would have ramifications later on as well. So there was a parliamentary opposition, even if it was rather impotent in terms of what it could do to prevent Cumann na Gael from implementing policy. But they did provide vocal, verbal opposition and provide a foil from time to time in debates whenever the Cumann na Gael government was implementing policy. So the further context that needs to be considered then before we consider the campaigns of 1927 is the challenges during this period from 1923 to 1927 that tended to sap the support of the Cumann na Gael government. So one of the first issues that's worth noting here was that of the army mutiny in 1924. Now, I won't go deep into the detail on the army mutiny, though you're free to ask me some questions afterwards if you wish, because it's quite myriad. There's a lot of characters and actors involved, and for those that you can see on the screen there, again on your left is General Richard Mulcahy, the Minister for Defence at the time. To his right is Joe McGrath, Minister for Industry and Commerce, someone who would support the mutineers essentially. The Minister for Defence was very much opposed to the mutineers, understandably, but Joe McGrath, another minister in government, was somewhat supportive of them. Then to his right is the rather acerbic at times, often caustic, very ambitious, but also very talented Minister for Justice, Kevin O'Higgins, who ended up being a rather interesting character during this entire affair also. And then the man below them there, with again a poor picture, I apologise, is Liam Tobin. He was one of the effective leaders of the mutiny within the perceived mutiny within the army at this time. So as I say, I won't go too much into the details. In fact, the subject of the army mutiny is a topic of a lecture that's previously been recorded under the auspices of this society, which is available online. But suffice it to say that some members of the Irish Army at this time had a number of grievances with the government. Some had to do with their possibility of mass demobilisation of what was a rather large Irish army at that time, much larger than we have now, and very costly. But the other reason that some of the mutineers ostensibly engaged in their mutiny was their belief, or their claimed belief at any rate, that the Cumann Gael government was failing to live up to the ideals of Michael Collins and was failed to use the treaty as a stepping stone to increase Irish sovereignty, to increase our independence, to further our separation from Britain, to establish a republic, and importantly to get back Northern Ireland. Now I'm wrapping it all up in a very quick bow there. It was more complicated than that, but you get the idea. So this was their view. The mutineers felt that there was elements in the Cumann Gael government who were not doing, they were not producing the goods from a more republican or nationalist perspective. And this was the reason many of them had been induced to accept the treaty in the first place, was that they felt that there would be a stepping stone to a more clear form of independence. So ultimately, again, I won't go into the details, ultimately the mutiny, or what it was, insofar as it was a mutiny, was suppressed quite rigorously in the end by the government, and it reorientated civil-military relations here in Ireland and ensured the primacy of politicians over the army. But what it also did was it led to something of a split within Cumann Gael. A section of the Cumann Gael party, broadly led by this minister, as I mentioned already, Joe McGrath, who was quite sympathetic to the perspective of the mutineers. This section of Cumann Gael effectively didn't quite leave Cumann Gael, but became a separate entity, a subsection of Cumann Gael for a period, and it became known as the National Group. Sometimes it's referred to as the National Party, but it's probably more accurate to call it the National Group. And they tried to advocate for a more republican, as they saw it, and a more nationalistic form of government within Cumann Gael. Now, this proved fruitless for them, and consequently then, as a show of kind of attempting to garner support from the people or to send a strong message, they all resigned, 9 of these TDs who formed this national group, 9 of them resigned en masse, and prompted something of a mini general election at that time then. Broadly speaking, it was intended to be a general election, or a kind of a mini general election on the subject of the treaty, essentially, and on the subject of furthering Irish independence. And so during this mini general election in March 1925, prompted by the mass resignation of the National Group from Parliament, of the 9 seats that were up for grabs, they were all previously Cumann Gael seats, 7 of them were retained by Cumann Gael. They won them back, if you will, from these guys who had resigned. But 2 of those seats ended up being won by Éamon de Valera's anti-treaty Sinn Féin party, which had now come into its own properly since the end of 1923. So what this showed us was that as early as 1924 into 1925, elements of Cumann Gael, which had seen themselves as more republican, if you will, or a bit more nationalistic, were starting to become disillusioned with the party. And this was going to be a source of some sapping of morale and of support as the years would proceed. The next issue, which was to be of difficulty for the government, was the Boundary Commission. The Boundary Commission, whose job was to essentially assess the border between Northern Ireland and the Free State, with a view to deciding whether or not there were elements of either of the 2 states which should be moved from one to the other. So in other words, the purpose of the Boundary Commission, which had been established or which had been stipulated for under the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, was to assess the various areas and see if there was significant population groupings in either the border area of Northern Ireland who were clearly nationalists and should be transferred to the south, or similarly, significant population groupings, probably of Unionists, in many cases from a religious perspective Protestants, on the border region of the Free State, who could or would wish to be transferred to Northern Ireland. So this was the purpose of the Boundary Commission. Now, it took some time for the Boundary Commission to be established. Difficulties due to the Civil War, the attempt to stabilise the state. It wasn't established until essentially the end of 1924. The problem was that the Irish government arguably took a very lax approach to the Boundary Commission. The appointed commissioner from the Irish government was Eoin MacNeill, and he was a very conscientious, diligent, very personable man, but probably not the most argumentative debater or negotiator you could put into a room. And with a consequence, it seems he was rather overawed to a certain extent, the story goes anyway, by the unionist member who was representing Northern Ireland, unofficially at any rate, on the Boundary Commission, and then by the judge, the independent judge, who happened to be South African and most likely had more than a small degree of sympathy with the unionist cause in Northern Ireland also. So with the consequence that when the draft report of the Boundary Commission ended up being leaked in an English newspaper towards the end of 1925, it caused consternation when it was discovered that not only would not huge sections of Northern Ireland be returned to the south, and it had been an expectation of many who had accepted the treaty in the south and who had accepted the treaty within Cumann na Gael, that the Boundary Commission would effectively carve up significant sections of Northern Ireland, particularly the counties of Fermanagh, Tyrone, most of Armagh, parts of the county of Derry and the city of Derry would all end up in the Free State. This was a perception that there was because they had large nationalist areas. But not only did that not happen, not only did the Boundary Commission draft report seem to indicate that there would only be minimal transfer of territory from the north to the south, but worse still, from the perspective of some, there were even areas of the south which would be transferred to the north. Oh heavens no, we couldn't have that. So this again created a lot of embarrassment for the Cumann na Gael government, and they ended up having to try and they did suppress the report officially anyway, and in the end, following an agreement with the British government and with the Northern Irish government, it was agreed there would be no changes whatsoever to the border. It would simply be left alone. Now, the Irish government did get something of a slight silver lining on this. They had their war debt, which the British had been expecting them to still pay from the First World War, because we were part of the United Kingdom that time, and we'd agreed to continue to pay a significant level of debt from our perspective for that war. That was quashed, and we didn't have to pay any more money in terms of war debt, and it was actually a significant amount of money. It was quite positive for the economy, but it was quite embarrassing for the government, and was to cause, again, a further split, if you will, within Cumann na Gael, resulting in the formation of a new political party called Clan Éireann, or the Irish Family, also sometimes known as the People's Party, under the leadership broadly of some members, but broadly one of the most high-ranking leaders, if you will, of this small section that broke away was a guy called Pádraig Ó Máille, who was at that point actually the last Ceann Comhairle, or the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament. So this formation of this Clan Éireann party, which was claiming to be more Republican than Cumann na Gael, was claiming to want to seek reunification more speedily, wanted to proceed towards a republic more speedily, wanted to abolish the repugnant, as they saw it, oath of fidelity or oath of allegiance to the British monarch. This party now had the potential to further suck away some original pro-treaty Sinn Féin Cumann na Gael support away from the Cumann na Gael party, which it had brought with it, as it were, in 1922, 1923. Okay, so, and then the next major challenge, arguably, even though it would take some time for the nature of it to present itself fully, was the arrival of Fianna Fáil. Established in 1926, this Fianna Fáil party under Éamon de Valera was his attempt to extricate himself from what he had seen at this point as the rather solipsistic and stultifying and restricting ideology which permeated the anti-treaty Sinn Féin party at that time, which he was still the leader of up until 1926. So as I mentioned already, back in 1923, Éamon de Valera's Republicans refused to enter the Dáil. They refused to enter the Irish Parliament because of the oath of fidelity, which they would be repugnant, as they said, to any Republican to take, but also because they didn't even recognise the legitimacy of the Irish Parliament, the Free State Parliament, that is, to exist anyway. They saw it as an illegitimate puppet Parliament imposed by the British. But by the time we got to the mid-1920s, de Valera's perspective on this was changing. He recognised that the Irish Free State was now established in fact, that the Cumann na Gael government was having the total run of the Dáil. It had control of all the machinery of government in the state, controlled the police, the army, everything else. The treaty wasn't going to be overturned by force of arms, and it wasn't going to be overturned by sitting outside the Dáil and being angry about it and refusing to recognise it. This was, I'm paraphrasing for effect here, but that was basically de Valera's perspective on the matter. And so his view was, if he could get rid of the oath of fidelity to the British King, which all Irish parliamentarians were expected to take when they first entered the Dáil. It was, again, a stipulation of the treaty, as many of you know. If that could be dispensed with, then he would see no reason why anti-treaty Sinn Féin TDs could not enter the Dáil. The problem was he couldn't convince the rest of the leadership of anti-treaty Sinn Féin to go along with him on this. He lost a vote in the party on that issue, with the result that he opted to leave anti-treaty Sinn Féin, and he brought his followers with him to form the new Fianna Fáil party in March 1926. Now, the primary difference then between Fianna Fáil and the anti-treaty Sinn Féin party that it left was simply that Fianna Fáil was prepared to recognise the de facto reality of the Southern Irish state. They still didn't like it, they still wanted to improve it, they still wanted to get rid of the treaty, and they still wanted to get a 32-county All-Ireland Republic. No change there, no difference there with their mother party in anti-treaty Sinn Féin. But now he was prepared to enter the Dáil to do this from the inside, but only if they could get rid of the oath first. So, and again, similar to Clan na Public, same scenario. They saw themselves as Republican, as irredentist, seeking a 32-county republic. But again, Clan Éireann were already in the Dáil, Fianna Fáil were still outside the Dáil. Okay. And when Fianna Fáil first left, or when De Valera left anti-treaty Sinn Féin in 1926, he took about half of the approximately 44, at that stage actually it was close to 47 I think, yeah, because they'd won a couple of by-elections. So he took about half of the 47 anti-treaty Sinn Féin TDs with him. So Fianna Fáil starting off at approximately 23 to 24 TDs, even though they weren't even in the Dáil. Okay, so the next challenge then, which but of course remember, this isn't too much of a challenge for Cumann na Gael yet, or with respect to elections, because Fianna Fáil are aiming at a different support base anyway. Now, the next challenge, perhaps potentially a more serious one in the short term, was from an old adversary. It was arguably a challenge from the right, and it was the establishment of what was known as the National League. So the National League was established in September 1926 by William Redmond. Some of you will know already that William Redmond was the son of John Redmond, the late leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, or the old Home Rule Party. So Redmond established this National League to be a constitutional, obviously, opposition party within the Free State, and it largely gained its initial support base anyway from, again, ex-Home Rulers, former Irish Parliamentary Party people, the party that Sinn Féin had supplanted at the 1918 election. Also, some ex-unionists, again, in the Southern Irish context, ex-unionists who would have felt, well, if I have to put my vote somewhere, I definitely don't want to give it to De Valera. He seems shockingly Republican. I don't know if I like giving it to Cumann na Gael either. They used to be Sinn Féin, so it was a much more attractive option to give the vote to an old school nationalist, as it were, Parliament Home Rule nationalist like William Redmond and his National League. Now, it also attracted some votes from a disgruntled section, arguably anyway, a disgruntled section of the centrist section of Cumann na Gael. So again, leaving aside the more Republican or irredentist nationalist groupings within Cumann na Gael, some of whom were being attracted to Clan Éireann, for instance. But the more centrist Cumann na Gaelers, who were becoming disgruntled with the Cumann na Gael government for maybe economic reasons, for reasons of maybe not progressing fast enough in certain legislative areas, because of what they saw maybe as lethargy in government. The normal reasons sometimes that people just get annoyed with governments when it's not major constitutional questions. So some of this support base arguably was also becoming attracted, for a time at any rate, to the National League. So they posed a potential threat then to Cumann na Gael from the right, as it were. And then the last context, before we get to the meal of the campaign itself, is the general despondency that there was in large sections of the country by the time we got to 1927. There was significant economic issues. The government had done reasonably well, actually, when you look at it in the broad sweep from a historical perspective, given the difficulties they inherited after the Civil War. But for many people on the ground, by the end of this administration in early 1927, there was a lot of financial difficulties and hardship. There'd been a major drop in cattle exports in the last couple of years of this administration, roughly 25 to 27, which Ireland being a predominantly agricultural country, in which cattle export was a significant feature, did not please many people quite understandably and led to a drop in living standards. There was also then various ways in which the government seemed to almost go out of its way to court unpopularity. So one example here was that it opposed a bill that was brought in by William Redmond's National League, a bill to try and give greater protection to those renting in towns and cities, the Town Tenants Bill, in other words. So the idea was to afford greater protection to these tenants in the event that they made improvements to their lodgings, etc. So the government opposed the bill. Their argument in much respects was that they felt the bill was improperly constructed and that it would lead to unforeseen difficulties, but there was also financial aspects to it as well. But either way, this did not go down well with those who were living in rented accommodation in cities and towns, and it meant then that a lot of these people then saw their hero, as they will, or at least their advocate, as being the National League under William Redmond. Then there was the Intoxicating Liquor Bill, or the Intoxicating Liquor Act of early 1927. This was an attempt by the government to restrict the level of liquor licences or vintners licences in the country. We had one of the largest per capita numbers of public houses in the world, well certainly in Europe anyway at that point in time. Certainly there was a lot of vintners at this stage, a lot of licences. So the government was seeking to curtail these somewhat and to limit the levels of trade, in other words the hours of trade. Now, you might think, from today's world, would that gain a lot of opposition? It did at the time, because again, there was an awful lot of people who either had licenses for trading or were related to people with licenses for trading. And the vintners and grocers lobby was very impactful and very organised at this point in time. So they ended up opposing the government and in time switched their allegiance, for a period at least anyway, to the National League. And then there was also some dissent within the party, particularly in relation to what they saw as the government's lax response to the Gaeltacht Commission report of the mid-1920s. Again, a report which advocated greater investment in Gaeltacht areas. And it wasn't that Cumann wasn't in favour of the Irish language, but again, there was arguments from people like Ernest Blythe, the Minister for Finance, who was a fluent Gaelic speaker or Irish speaker himself. We simply don't have the money for a lot of these things, so a lot of this stuff has to be put on the shelf. So by the time you get to the first 1927 election, Cumann Gael is seen as a very conservative party of the right by many people, economically and socially conservative, and indeed constitutionally conservative and lethargic from the perspective of those who want a new dispensation vis-à-vis the treaty. And of course, as I say, the work of those such as Mel Farrell and indeed Professor Ciara Meehan have indicated that the party almost eschewed or abjured popularity. It almost took decisions and defended them on the basis of this is the right decision to make no matter who it annoys, even if it's right before an election. So going into the election campaign then of May and into June of 1927, when the election was called in May, there was a broad range of parties and interests that the electorate would have the ability to choose from. And these included those we've gone through already, Cumann Gael, the Labourers Party, the Farmers Party, etc. You had two anti-treaty groupings now, anti-treaty Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil. You had a more Republican pro-treatyite grouping in Clonaireann. You had a more centrist, slightly right-wing, economically, well, it was somewhat mixed actually economically from their perspective, the National League Party. Some of their views could arguably be quite progressive in some ways, others more restrictive. Then you had a group called the Blind Men's Party, which I think it's obvious enough from the title. It was a small sectional group from the National Association of the Blind who were seeking to improve the lot of people whose sight was stricken, and particularly with respect to increasing their pension payments. And again, a few years earlier, there had been a shilling taken off the old age pension by Ernest Blythe, which earned him the opprobrium of people basically forever. Since then, he's never been forgiven for it by anyone nearly in any party. And so the Blind Men's Party was seeking a return of that shilling in addition to more indeed. There was also the Town Tenants Association, which I mentioned already. They put up a couple of candidates. Sorry, the Blind Men's Party only put up 2 candidates as far as I recall in the Dublin area. But again, there was a choice there in Dublin. The Town Tenants Association put up a number of candidates, but again, much of their support base probably would have seeped to the National League for reasons I mentioned already, and of course then there were the independents. So this was the state of play as we entered into the campaign itself. So how did the campaign go? Well, the Cumann Gael campaign largely focused on their record. They focused on claiming and stating that they were the party of sound finance, the one that could, and the party that had stabilised the state and protected it in its dire hours of the Civil War. They had helped to expand sovereignty legally, peacefully, as far as they were concerned, and there was some truth in this. in the sense that even just the year before, at the Imperial Conference, as it was known, or generally now the Commonwealth Conference, if you will, it was the Irish Free State ministers who were most active in lobbying the other Dominion states of, say, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and getting them all to organise themselves so as to pressure the British to concede, ultimately, that the Dominion states were equal to Britain in the Commonwealth itself. And that after then as well, that the British Parliament could not create legislation in Parliament in Britain that would impact on a Dominion without the Dominion's consent. So this was seen as reasonably significant. Now, small steps from some people's perspective, but nevertheless significant. They also argued, Cumann and Dáil at this time, that they were advocating for a positive future of sound investment, and one of the jewels in the crown that they were putting forward here was the Shannon scheme, as it was known, the large hydroelectric power plant at Ardnacrusha. It was not yet built in 1927, but it was in the process. It was a heavy investment, and it was something that they were showcasing, if you will, during that election. They spent a lot of time attacking Fianna Fáil during the election, largely on the argument that that Fianna Fáil remained abstentionists and not entering Parliament. Now, there's a certain irony here, because if Fianna Fáil had entered Parliament any earlier than they did, it would have created difficulties for Cumann and Dáil vis-à-vis their own majority, Cumann and Dáil's majority in Parliament. Remember, Cumann and Dáil had a good working majority in Parliament precisely because so many anti-treatyites refused to enter the Dáil. But nevertheless, they attacked Fianna Fáil on its abstentionist policy. They also warned against diluting the pro-treaty vote. So in other words, diluting the vote between these other parties like the Farmers' Party and the National League and Clan Éireann, etc. So they were warning the electorate about that. However, there wasn't the same order versus anarchy theme that there was in the 1923 election. Now, I know I haven't discussed the 1923 election campaign, but it was a campaign heavily infused with security rhetoric, heavily infused with the arguments, only our party, the Cumann and Dáil party, can save the Irish people from the anarchy that would be bestowed upon them if they vote for the anti-treatyites, or they vote for groupings aligned with the anti-treaty IRA. But there was much less of that order versus anarchy theme in the June 1927 election from Cumann and Dáil. They largely focused on economic matters and, as I say, attacking Fianna Fáil for its abstentionism. Now, in terms of organisation, by 1927, I say, Cumann and Dáil was somewhat tired. The organisation was tired as well, and it didn't have a lot of didn't have a major energetic volunteer base, and it largely relied on paid professional canvassers and our party organisers to go around and try and invigorate the Cumann or the various branches in the constituencies. So it lacked really the dynamism of some of the other parties, the newer parties, and in particular it lacked the dynamism of Fianna Fáil. So there was also kind of a collective leadership in relation to the campaign at this time. There wasn't, although I have his picture there, there wasn't a personality focus by Cumann and Dáil on their leader of W.T. Cosgrave. He wasn't held up as some special centrifugal force around which we should all galvanise ourselves. All the leaders, or the main leaders of Cumann and Dáil, be it W.T. Cosgrave himself, Kevin O'Higgins, Ernest Blythe, etc., they all kind of did their own thing to a certain extent in the constituencies, and were all seen as almost equal in terms of their level of gravitas, if you will. This is very different to the approach that Fianna Fáil took with respect to their man, Éamon de Valera. So broadly speaking, it was a lacklustre campaign in many ways on the part of Cumann and Dáil. So what about the Fianna Fáil campaign? Well, as I say, theirs was far from lacklustre. There were significant levels of party activism, and remember, not only did de Valera take approximately half of all the anti-treaty Sinn Féin TDs with him when he formed Fianna Fáil, but he took really the bulk of the actual organisation and activist base on the ground in many ways when he formed Fianna Fáil in 1926. And because it was a new departure, an attempt to get into the Dáil and really make a difference in there, if they can get in past the issue of the oath, this galvanised a lot of their support base. And again, you had people who were eager to hit back at the Cosgrave government as they saw it. They didn't like them anyway because they were pro-treatyites, but they didn't like them even more because of, or you could argue they didn't like them even more because of what they saw as the poor economic performance of the Cumann and Dáil government in the last few years of its administration up until 1927. So it was a very dynamic campaign on the part of Fianna Fáil with a highly organised activist base. And there was almost a cult of personality promoted in relation to de Valera. He was the centrifugal force for the members of Fianna Fáil, and he was presented to the electorate in that way as a centrifugal force, something we can rally around, a man you can admire, a man you can live up to, a man you can follow. And those of us who don't like the great man theory of history, if there's many in the room who don't like, or great woman theory of history either for that matter, that's fair enough, but sometimes it does actually work. Sometimes a single person can make a difference, and it can certainly be a galvanising force for people at election time. And De Valera was that for Fianna Fáil. Now, it largely campaigned again on its nationalism. It played the green card quite significantly, that it was going to, if it gets into power, it will seek to dismantle the treaty, abolish the oath, further separate themselves from Britain, and ultimately achieve a unified Ireland in other words, bringing the North into the Free State, but ultimately for the purpose of creating an independent republic, and therefore, in effect, dismantling the Free State also, if you will. Now, however, it also campaigned on bread and butter issues. It also campaigned on matters of economic, fiscal policy, etc., castigating the Cosgrave government whenever they could on its failure to ensure that there was significant houses built for people who needed them, that there was sufficient investment in public services, etc. So they'd take a somewhat left of centre approach at the very least from an economic perspective. And they also advocated the old Sinn Féin policy of economic protectionism. In other words, of building up Irish industry by preventing foreign, essentially, as it were, goods from coming in unless it was at very high taxes, and helping domestic or native Irish industry to establish itself so that Ireland could become self-sufficient. It also argued that it was the only government that could actually provide only party that could actually provide stable government, because it would ensure that no single party would ever be excluded from what it called the National Assembly, in other words, the Dáil, by virtue of a repugnant oath of allegiance that no Republican or even no Irish man or woman could ever take in good conscience. This was their argument. They also caused some degree of perhaps confusion for a period, in that their election paraphernalia included the quite striking claim, Fianna Fáil is going in. The next government will be a Fianna Fáil government. And then, of course, sack the lot. Now, sack the lot in reference to Cosgrave and his grouping makes sense from a rhetorical perspective, but what did Fianna Fáil mean by it was going in? So there was some confusion among some of the electorate. Was De Valera actually going to go in or not? Because to go in, he would need to take the oath. So this was going to be a potential problem. Now, in terms of the alternatives to the old Sinn Féin parties of Cumann na Gael and Fianna Fáil, there were those alternatives that we mentioned already. And in their campaign, the Labour Party largely emphasised its record as a responsible opposition, together with promises of expanding housing and education and employment. Essentially a left-wing perspective, obviously. And its leader, Thomas Johnson, hoped that the campaign would take place in a very gentlemanly manner, that there wouldn't be a lot of negativity between the parties. There was a certain irony there in that now this Labour Party advertisement is actually for a by-election after the general election, but nevertheless it gives you an idea that some within Labour didn't always want to be too gentlemanly themselves when it was dealing with the others. And in this particular by-election they were claiming enough of the gunmen, don't vote for the gunmen, and they were referencing both of the old Sinn Féin parties here, Cumann na Gael and Fianna Fáil, that the choice should be a Labour candidate, not a Cosgraveite or a De Valeraite, as it were. The National League, again, largely attacked the government on its failure to protect Northern nationalists. So the National League played something of a green card itself at this time, which is not entirely unsurprising given the nature of the old Irish Parliamentary Party itself, which actually had a significant support base in what became Northern Ireland. So they very much attacked the government on its failure over the Boundary Commission in many ways, and its failure to get sections of Northern Ireland back, and particularly to protect nationalists in Northern Ireland as they saw it. Some candidates in the National League also attacked the government on what they called, or what they referred, the Shannon mystery. In other words, this was the proposed hydroelectric power plant at Shannon, a huge investment of many, many millions, which was a lot of money back then. And they were claiming this was a waste of money. This was basically a white elephant. But worse still, even one National League candidate claimed it was a form of Leninism in Ireland. And the first form of Leninism outside Moscow, indeed, was the claim of one National League candidate. I'm sure any number of Cumann na Gael activists and quite a few historians since would laugh at the idea that Cumann na Gael were being accused of Leninism of all things, but nevertheless, this was the claim by one National League figure. And then the Farmers' Party, they largely campaigned on the issues of fiscal rectitude, lowering taxation and decreasing spending, and then helping to foster growth in agriculture. And they were more restrained in their criticism of the government, and for reasons again that I alluded to earlier and will outline again, they were often quite supportive at times of the Cumann na Gael government. So they tended to attack again the Labour for potential profligate spending if they got into power, Fianna Fáil for potential profligate spending if they got into power, and were more restrained in their attacks on the government. So how did it all work out? Well, as you can see here, Cumann na Gael had a disastrous election from their perspective. They returned with 47 seats, which was a decrease of 16 from the previous outing. Fianna Fáil returned with 44 seats, which technically was nearly double what they went into the election with, but remember, they were taking effectively all those seats from the old anti-treaty Sinn Féin grouping, which would have had 47 at one point. The Labour Party had a great election, returned with 22 seats, an increase of 8. The Farmers' Party, they did not have such a good election now. They returned with 11 seats, a decrease of 4. The National League returned with 8 seats. They'd had 2 going in, so this was a fairly decent response for their return for them. And then the Independents had a reasonably good election, though they're obviously a rather multifarious group, but they returned with 16 seats. So again, if you consider the scenario here then, in the aftermath of the June election, well, how was a government going to be formed, one might ask, in one sense. So an actual majority would have been 77. Cumann na Gael were far off that. A working majority, if you excluded most of the anti-treatyites, would be closer to 55. However, the scenario is that Cumann na Gael only returned with 47. So remember, from the period 23 to 27, Cumann na Gael were already a minority government. They were just a majority because of the reality of the abstentionist TDs not being in Parliament. So they could work a majority that way. Now they're a minority of a minority. It's effectively a double minority in Parliament. So even though De Valera and Fianna Fáil would not enter Parliament, Cumann na Gael would still be in a minority. And this is notwithstanding the fact that De Valera and Fianna Fáil did try to enter Parliament. In the aftermath of the election, they turned up at the Dáil and were essentially demanding that they be allowed to enter the Dáil chamber. But they were refused by the clerk of the Dáil because they were told, well, in order to enter the Dáil chamber, you have to sign the oath, or you have to sign the book in which the oath is inscribed, and De Valera refused to do that, as did his other 43 TDs, and consequently they were told that they can't enter the Dáil chamber, so they withdrew. So that's fine. The De Valera and the Fianna Fáil grouping are not in Parliament, but still, even with just 47 TDs, Cumann na Gael could not form a majority government on their own. Any of the other groupings, well, all the other groupings, if they combined together, the Labour Party, the Farmers' Party, the National League and the Independents, would have more in a way than Cumann na Gael. So where did that leave Cosgrave? Well, as I say, it left him as a double minority government. Initially, he was prepared to go into opposition and said it's up to the current opposition to form a government themselves. But by virtue of the fact that none of the other rather fissiparous groups or multifaceted or multifarious groups could agree to form a government together, coupled with the fact that significant sections of the Farmers' Party were rather sympathetic to Cumann na Gael anyway, it meant that no alternative government could be formed, and basically the Farmers' Party and a number of independents voted in favour of Cosgrave being returned as Taoiseach as President of the Executive Council once more. That was the term for the Premier of the government, the President of the Executive Council. So Cosgrave is back in government again, but in a rather precarious position in terms of his the Dáil arithmetic. If he can't maintain the support of other parties in the Dáil, he won't remain in government. And worse still, should Fianna Fáil actually come in to the Dáil, he won't be able to, it's unlikely he'll be able to maintain a majority in the Dáil either. However, worse was to come, if you will, for the government, in that there was to be crises, a number of crises you could argue, in the interregnum between this election and the second election of September 1927. So firstly, on the 10th of July, just a couple of weeks after the government had been returned, the Minister for Home Affairs, or the Minister for Justice, Kevin O'Higgins, was returning was leaving his home to go to Mass when he was accosted by three members of the anti-treaty IRA. He was shot and he ultimately died from his wounds. So it was a deliberate assassination. It was clearly a deliberate murder. They knew who he was. The question remained as to whether they'd intended to assassinate him in the first place. Had they happened upon him accidentally, or was it part of a concerted effort to attack members of or to attack him personally? That remains a little bit unclear. What we do know is that the government regarded it as a direct attack on the state at the time. And they worried significantly that it was a prelude to maybe a replay of the Civil War. And indeed, one government minister referred to it as an attempt to assassinate the state itself. So the government responded robustly and very quickly by implementing a Public Safety Act, in which they could proscribe or make illegal basically any organisation that they wanted, as long as they felt they had good reason. They also suspended habeas corpus in certain circumstances, increased the widespread powers of arrest for the Gardaí. They reintroduced internment, should it be necessary, and they also reintroduced military tribunals, which could impose the death penalty. So the second two elements then which the government responded with to this attack, as they saw on the state itself, was what was known as the Constitution Amendment Act. So they amended the Constitution so as to prevent Fianna Fáil from doing something that Fianna Fáil was at this point attempting to do, which is to bring about a referendum on the oath itself for entering Parliament. So as I mentioned, when De Valera and Fianna Fáil had turned up after the June election, they had been refused entry to the Dáil, and in response to that, they had attempted to try and garner 75,000 signatures with a view to provoking a referendum, which was allowed under the Free State Constitution at that time. You could propose a referendum if you had 75,000 signatures, or if you were members of Parliament within Parliament to pass a bill to that effect. So they were in the process of garnering these signatures with a view to trying provoking a referendum. The government knew this, the Cumann Gael government knew this, so what they opted to do was to amend the Constitution to prevent Fianna Fáil from obtaining the right to hold this referendum. So in other words, you had to be in the Dáil and propose the referendum from inside the Dáil, to cut a long story short. This was the new legislation. So this would curtail Fianna Fáil's freedom of manoeuvre. And then the second element that they brought in, the government, was an Electoral Amendment Act, in which it would force any future TD who was standing for election to sign a pledge that in the event he or she was elected, they would then take their oath and enter the Dáil. So it was like an oath to take an oath kind of a scenario. This is the way Fianna Fáil presented it, and when they tried to lampoon it subsequently. But this electoral law would effectively force any future candidate, in other words, it would effectively force Fianna Fáil in the future to enter Parliament if they went for election again. Now you might ask, why were Cumann Gael doing this? Why were they trying to force Fianna Fáil into Parliament? Given that once Fianna Fáil entered Parliament, there would be a significant problem for Cumann Gael, and that they would have the seat difference between them and Fianna Fáil was quite low. Well, the reason is essentially that from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of Cumann Gael, having a large anti-treatyite section like Fianna Fáil as a political entity outside Parliament, that kind of provided the political and ideological water in which much more subversive and paramilitary and militant fish could swim. So in other words, their view was having a large body of political opinion which represents huge swathes of the population, disgruntled, aggrieved and outside the constitutional process and refusing to come into it. It allowed for potential sympathies and for elements within the more militant anti-treaty IRA to garner support or to find allegiances and ideological allies. So the government's view was, or Cumann Gael's view was, get everyone into Parliament, make them work the Constitution inside Parliament, and this will hopefully make the state more stable. This was, in effect, their response to the murder of Kevin O'Higgins. So there was visceral denunciations, of course, of this policy and this approach by Fianna Fáil, but it was also opposed in Parliament by both the Labour and the National League parties. They particularly opposed the Public Safety Act. They saw it as draconian and unnecessary. But they also opposed elements of the Electoral Amendment Act as well. They felt that it was unconscionable in some ways to force a man or woman to take an oath that they didn't want to take just to sit in Parliament. Or to run for election, I apologise. Okay, so however, it worked to an extent. It worked in the sense that it forced Fianna Fáil into Parliament, but it also caused soon caused a crisis in the Parliament itself for the government. So, as a consequence of the Electoral Amendment Act, De Valera recognised now, much as he had recognised when he was in anti-treaty Sinn Féin that he would have to change his approach if he wanted to undermine the treaty and improve the state as he saw it, he also recognised that now he could face political extinction if he was and if Fianna Fáil were unable to run for election again at a future date and take their seats. There was a recognition on his part that he either needed to take his seats now and try to change things from within, or perhaps face political oblivion. Because again, in the future, if a TD refused to take the oath after they'd already signed the pledge to say that they would during the election, their seat would be taken off them, they'd be disqualified, and somebody else would be able to take it. So De Valera recognised it's the end of the road here, effectively, with the result that on the 12th of August, he and his other 43 Fianna Fáil deputies entered Parliament and signed the book, which had the oath inscribed on it, what he regarded or claimed as an empty formula, so that he could ultimately take his seats in Parliament. And that's a whole different story of itself, so I won't engage in too much detail on that, but there was obviously a lot of counterclaims by the opposition afterwards. If it was an empty formula in 1927 and you could take it in good conscience, why couldn't you have done it in 1922, 1923 and saved all the hassle of the Civil War, etc. This kind of barbed attacks were thrown at De Valera at the time, and indeed subsequently as well. Though from De Valera's perspective, it was a case of having to enter the Dáil at that point, having no choice or else face political oblivion. However, with De Valera and his ultimately now 44, in fact technically 45 Fianna Fáil TDs, because one of the independents joined Fianna Fáil shortly after the June 1927 election. With his 45 TDs in Parliament now, De Valera now presented a very unique opportunity, one that we've never actually had in this state since, in effect, which was it presented the opportunity for, technically speaking anyway, a left-led government in the Irish state. So as I mentioned, you've got the opposition parties plus Éamon de Valera, the original opposition parties plus Éamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil on 44 seats, significantly more than Cumann na Gael, if they're all added together. But Cumann na Gael could rely largely on the Farmers' Party and a number of independents to support it prior to Fianna Fáil coming in at any rate. And they could anticipate they could continue to get that support with Fianna Fáil in Parliament as well. But now an arrangement began to be made, or was being made, between Fianna Fáil and the National League. And the Labour Party. Indeed, even before De Valera had entered the Dáil, there had been negotiations of a type in advance between the National League, between the Labour Party and Fianna Fáil, in that if Fianna Fáil entered Parliament, Fianna Fáil would offer to provide something of a confidence and supply arrangement to a coalition government which was incorporating the Labour Party and the National League. So in other words, the Labour Party and the National League would form the new government. And even though they would have substantially less TDs than, say, Cumann na Gael and the Farmers' Party, because they'd have the outside support of Fianna Fáil, as an outside silent partner, or not so silent partner, but an outside partner voting with them and for them, that way then Thomas Johnson, the leader of the Labour Party, could be elected the President of the Executive Council, or Taoiseach as we call it now, and William Redmond would become the Vice President. So a Labour National League government with Fianna Fáil support from the outside. So this seems like now as a rather tantalising prospect, if you will, and it almost came to fruition. It almost happened. On the 16th of August, the leader of the Labour Party, Thomas Johnson, put down a motion of no confidence in Cosgrave's government. And it looks set that and again, De Valera is in the Dáil now at this point, so it looks set that when you combine the votes of Fianna Fáil, the National League, the Labour Party, and possibly some of the independents, that you could have a slight majority over Cumann na Gael, the Farmers' Party, and also their assortment of independents. And it looked like the government was set to lose the vote. However, the situation was jinxed, as some might say. One member, so it seemed virtually certain based on the arithmetic as far as the opposition was concerned, that they would have 72 votes to 70 for the government. This was the perception that there would be. But this was dependent on virtually all the National League TDs and the Labour TDs and, of course, Fianna Fáil voting in favour of the motion no confidence. But at the last minute, as it were, just before the motion of no confidence was set to be, before the division of the members was to be counted, it turned out that one member of the National League, a man called John Jinks, he was missing. So he was a member of the National League. The leader of the National League said, my men will all vote against the government, but Jinks was missing. With the result then that the government survived the no confidence vote by one vote, because the casting vote of the Ceann Comhairle, Michael Hayes, was in favour of the government. Generally, the Speaker of the Parliament will vote with the government if there's a 50-50 tie in terms of the numbers. So it was a 71-71 tie, and then the Ceann Comhairle voted in favour of the government. So Cosgrave survived, if you will, or the Cumann Gael government survived the motion of no confidence by the skin of its teeth, but it survived nonetheless. Now, there's been many stories since as to what happened. There was rumours going around that John Jinks was spirited away by unknown people in order to prevent him from being there. Others claiming that he was plied with drink and that he was put on a train and sent back to Sligo Leitrim by nefarious members of Cumann Gael or of the Farmers' Party, etc. But all that, as it turns out, is unlikely to be true, because very shortly afterwards, Jinks explained why he decided to absent himself from the Dáil. It was because he had not agreed with the National Party's position. He felt he had not been, that he felt that his leader, William Redmond, had not adequately outlined to him the nature of this coalition government and the fact that they would be relying clearly, or that they would end up in a government where they would be relying solely on the good auspices of Éamon de Valera and his Fianna Fáil from the outside. And he claimed, I felt that I could never have anything to do with Mr. de Valera, for I always have been and propose to remain a constitutional nationalist. So Jinks obviously had tendencies or potential sympathies towards the more pro-treatyite wing at this point, and indeed later on he would leave the National League and he would join Cumann Gael indeed. So this was a brief reprieve for the government, but it also set about the process for realignment. The government had survived this no confidence motion. Could it be guaranteed to survive another one? It would all depend on whether or not enough TDs of the right parties were in the Dáil on the day in question. So this was a very precarious position for Cumann Gael to be in. However, there were two by-elections held in Dublin in August of 1927. And one by-election was caused by the death of Kevin O'Higgins, their own Cumann Gael TD. The other by-election had been caused by the death of Countess Markovics, who was at that time a Fianna Fáil TD. So one from either side, if you will. The government won both by-elections. Now, winning the by-election that in Kevin O'Higgins' constituency, of course, made sense. The fact that they won a seat back from Fianna Fáil, if you will, or won a Fianna Fáil seat, this was a significant level boost of encouragement for Cosgrave and for the government, and was seen as possibly something of a sympathy vote for Cumann Gael in the aftermath of the murder of Kevin O'Higgins. Just a few weeks after the June election. So in other words, there was a possibility that all that protest vote, if you will, that had gone against Cumann Gael in June 1927, particularly towards the National League and in some ways towards Labour as well, some of that might come back to Cumann Gael now. This might well be the right time. I'm not going to claim that Cosgrave was thinking exactly that way, but whatever his reasoning, it's exactly what he did. It's exactly how he approached it in the end. Because hours after the government won, or were seen to have won the by-elections in Dublin in August, in which they now had 2 extra seats, Cosgrave went to the Governor-General, who was the representative of the British King in Ireland and who had the power to dissolve our Parliament. He went to the Governor-General and asked for Parliament to be dissolved immediately and to have a snap general election on the basis of this, you could call it a slight level of good news for the government's position. So this was criticised heavily at the time by members of the opposition. They saw it as an attempt to wrong foot the opposition, and even Éamon de Valera was to refer to Cosgrave's approach here as sharp practice, he called it, which was somewhat ironic because some of you know Mr. de Valera had something of a penchant for calling snap general elections himself once he got into power, but at any rate he saw it as sharp practice at the time. Okay, so that means then that we're into a new election campaign for the September election of 1927. So the The Cumann na Gael campaign now was different from the last time. They were now energised, they were now buoyed, they were now aware of the difficulties, the lethargy they had been suffering from in June 1923 and the difficulty it presented for them and the loss of seats. They wanted to overcome that. Secondly, they moved their focus away from the more bread and butter issues, the sound finance issues and the stable government issues that they had provided over the last few years, and focused heavily on simply stable government, and focused on stable government or anarchy. They were basically claiming, you vote for us or you'll end up with anarchy. You could end up with Fianna Fáil in power, which means anti-treaty IRA are in power effectively. This was the kind of claim that the Cumann na Gael were claims that Cumann na Gael were making. They repeatedly during the campaign were associating Fianna Fáil with gunmen, assassins, criminals, turmoil and bloodshed. These are actual words from the campaign that were repeatedly used, regularly used. Cosgrave himself used a significant amount of what you could call religio-security rhetoric. In other words, he was linking security of the state with religious elements. And at one point, for instance, he claimed that the Public Safety Act implemented a few months before that, which included even the death penalty, was for subversion or paramilitarism, its purpose, he claimed, was to assert the authority of the Ten Commandments in this country. And he was to claim that by re-electing the government, it was not a question of mere politics or of mere support of a party. It was a question of good order, of religion, of public morality, of the public's determination that the will of the people would be supreme. So this was a constant trope throughout. They also attacked, in addition to attacking Fianna Fáil, they regularly attacked the Labour Party and the National League as potential puppets of De Valera, keeping in mind again what I mentioned about the potential coalition arrangement with De Valera on the outside. So Labour and National League were repeatedly attacked as puppets by Cumann na Gael at this time. And so, as I say, the events since June had significantly galvanised their support base and their activist base, with the result that this was one of the most energetic campaigns seen in the Free State to date, and they even employed a professional advertising agency to help them in what Mel Farrell has referred to as the slickest campaign then seen in the Free State. So the Fianna Fáil campaign, well, they continued to play the green card, as it were, but they also now attempted to, and so they kept their irredentist nationalism to the fore, their republicanism as they saw it, their desire to reunify Ireland, etc. But they also attempted to focus as heavily as they could on Cumann na Gael's budgetary policy and what they saw as their fiscal failures. And again, they advocated for increased intervention in industry, and again advocating regularly for economic protectionism, claiming that their objective was to make the nation as self-contained and self-sufficient as possible. Now, Fianna Fáil endured a significant amount of criticism, not just, as I say, from Cumann na Gael, but even from the press, from the media at this time, particularly papers like the Irish Times and the Irish Independent. And there were regular references to De Valera's seeming hypocrisy and about turn on the issue of the oath, and again references to his involvement or his influence at the beginning of the Civil War back in 1922. And it's arguable, and then in response to this, at one point De Valera was to declare that the newspapers in Ireland were the biggest enemy of peace in this country. So this kind of experience almost certainly was what propelled De Valera to eventually establish his own newspaper, as it were, the Irish Press, subsequently. Now, however, their activist volunteer base, Fianna Fáil's activist volunteer base, was again energised in advance of this election. The success at the June election, together with the general positive response they got within their own constituency, as a consequence of De Valera going into Parliament in June and into July of 1927, actually buoyed them even further. It didn't impact negatively on Fianna Fáil, and actually it had the opposite effect. And it resulted in, and now because De Valera was in Parliament, he now seemed like a slightly more attractive possibility to even people who weren't naturally anti-treatyite. He now seemed like, he's moving towards the constitutional position, and I like some of his economic ideas. Okay, maybe I'll vote for Fianna Fáil. So it actually increased Fianna Fáil's potential attractiveness to other voters outside their normal constituency. So how did the election turn out then? Well, it was a success for both of the old Sinn Féin parties, both for Cumann na Gael and for Fianna Fáil. They both increased their seats. Cumann na Gael increased their seats by 15 to 62. As you can see here, when you look at the decrease in seats for the National League, they lost 6. The decrease in seats for the Farmers' Party, they lost 5. And the decrease as well, to a certain extent, in seats for Labour. Cumann na Gael won back a lot of seats from what you could call the pro-treaty element that had somewhat abandoned them as a protest vote back in June 1927. They won a lot of those back. So they returned to they returned with 62 seats. Fianna Fáil, as I say, also had an excellent election from their perspective, increasing their seat tally by 13 to a total of 57. Labour, as I mentioned already, were down. Farmers' Party were down by 5. The National League, as a consequence of, I suppose, their, in some respects, what might have been seen as their playing potential midwife to a Fianna Fáil-backed government, which would be controlled by De Valera, it's probable that elements of their support base became disgruntled with William Redmond and ended up switching their vote back to Cumann na Gael. And then the independents returned with 12 seats, a decrease on 3. There was various hues there. Actually, the Cumann na Gael seat tally was to increase by 1, really, actually, a few months later. One of the seats that was won by James Larkin he ended up being disqualified from holding his seat due to bankruptcy. So there was a by-election in 1928, and Cumann na Gael won that by-election as well. So in reality, they actually had 63 seats after this point in time. But where did that leave them then in numerical terms in the Dáil and when it comes to forming a government? Well, ultimately, the Farmers' Party were now prepared to vote essentially with Cumann na Gael in government to ensure that De Valera would not get in essence, to make it simple as it were. And most of the independents were also prepared, because again, 9 of them came from an ex-unionist hue, some of them from also an ex-parliamentary party hue or persuasion. Very few of them were from the more radical anti-treatyite persuasion, or likely to be particularly supportive of Éamon de Valera's recent past at any rate. So most of the independents were prepared to vote with the government, with the result then that on the 11th of October 1927, Cosgrave was re-elected as President of the Executive Council in a vote in the Dáil, winning by 76 votes to 70. So a 6-vote majority there, and it virtually guaranteed then that this particular government, unless there was major issues, would remain in firm control of the reins of power from 1927 until the next general election of 1932. Moreover, it also confirmed that Fianna Fáil would be the main opposition party from 1927 onwards until the next election in 1932. And indeed, Fianna Fáil were quite pleased to be able to sit back in Parliament, if you will, bide their time as a obvious government in waiting, just waiting to bide their time until they could overcome Cumann na Gael at the next election. Okay, so the June election indicated that there was a fragmented pro-treaty vote, one which had the potential to undermine Cumann na Gael significantly. The June election also had shown that there would be difficulty potentially with the ability to form a stable government inside the Dáil, even with the abstentionist TDs on the outside. And then lastly, the June election, another consequence of it, particularly when you combine it with the murder of Kevin O'Higgins, well, it was a circumstance that forced ultimately in the end Fianna Fáil into Parliament. So these were the 3 primary consequences of the June election of 1927. An indication of fragmented pro-treatyite vote, a potential instability in Parliament itself, and then ultimately, however, the forcing of Fianna Fáil into Parliament. One of the consequences of the September election then was that it weakened the smaller parties. It clearly showed that, after the September election, it was clear that there was now there was a consolidation of much of the voter base around the 2 big beasts, the 2 larger parties. These were the 2 major consequences, if you will, of the September election. And then taken together, the last consequence of both June and September was that it served to concrete Irish democracy. First in June, by contributing, at least in part, to the context that brought De Valera in from the cold, and then through Fianna Fáil's further gains in September, it convinced that section of the formerly recalcitrant anti-treatyite base that working within the established constitutional system could provide them with the means to achieve their goals peacefully and democratically, as in many respects Fianna Fáil did after 1932. So, in conclusion, I promise, in an article from 2022, penned for the 100th anniversary of the treaty election, Professor Michael Gallagher observed, quote, the general election held on the 16th of June 1922 may not stand out amidst the many dramatic events of the period 1916 to 1923. Yet, by embodying the principle that political power is determined by the support of the people at a democratic election and not by force of arms, it was that election, rather than the civil war that followed, that set the tone for politics in the independent Irish state. Now, this perceptive and inarguably accurate observation in relation to the 1922 election is one that can also be applied, at least in part, to the two later elections that we examined this evening. In the popular mind, the general elections of 1927 are largely unknown, and whilst they may be recognised with at least a passing interest by those familiar with our parliamentary history, they do not, to paraphrase Gallagher, stand out amidst the more dramatic electoral campaigns that accompanied the 1922, 1923, 1932 or 1933 electoral contests. And yet, as we have seen, they were nevertheless crucial stepping stones towards the concretisation of Irish democracy. Whilst the outcome of the June 1927 election may have initially appeared to cast doubt on the ability of the then wholly constitutional parties to form a stable government at all, the adaptability and the resilience of our democratic process would reveal itself in short order at the subsequent September contest. Moreover, the enactment of the draconian public safety measures, moreover, the interregnum of that summer, which saw the shocking murder of a minister and the enactment of draconian public safety measures, was also quickly followed by the clear, if grudging, envelopment of a large body of hitherto extra-constitutional political actors, namely Fianna Fáil, and their support base within the established Irish constitutional structure. Thus, if indeed it was the case that the choice that faced the Irish state in 1927 was between stability or chaos, then it is evident that in the final analysis, the electorate plumped squarely and decisively for the former. Thank you for your time and for listening.